The early 20th century was a time of massive transformation. We saw the rise of institutional healthcare, the formalization of health insurance, the birth of diagnostic tools like x rays and gastroscopes, and the growing influence of moral and religious values in shaping public health systems. Throughout this period, you'll notice a recurring theme. Technology wasn't just mechanical, it was moral. Whether it was light therapy, blood pressure measurement, or improvised nursery care during the Great Depression, every innovation was shaped by both necessity and values. People believed technology could heal and that managing it well was a form of service. Clinical engineering as a formal discipline would later come, but its spiritual, ethical, and technical foundations were already being laid during this time. We'll explore key milestones from Betts therapy schools to Schindler's diagnostic clinics and examine how engineers today carry on the work of ensuring that healthcare systems remain safe, reliable, and ethically grounded. At the turn of the 20th century, America was rapidly industrializing, and the same principles that were transforming factories, efficiency, standardization, and training were being applied to healthcare. Therapy schools, many of them led or inspired by entrepreneurs like Frank S. Betts, taught practitioners how to use heat, light, and electrotherapy devices in consistent, systematized ways. But this was more than mechanical instruction. The progressive era was deeply moral in tone. Religious organizations saw these schools as a way to serve, to train healers, not just in technique, but in calling. Therapy became a form of service rooted in humility, discipline, and care. These values, technical mastery, ethical commitment, and the framing of health as sacred, are the same values that clinical engineers now carry forward. What we begin to see here is the transformation of medicine into a systems practice. And that's exactly where clinical engineering begins to take shape. The early 1900s were a time of great reform and reinvention in the United States. We were well into the progressive era, a movement that aimed to correct the excesses of industrial capitalism by improving public systems, including healthcare, education, and labor conditions. This was also a moment when the federal government began taking public health seriously. Agencies began forming, legislation like the Pure Food and Drug Act was passed. Health wasn't just a private matter anymore. It became something the state could monitor, regulate, and promote as a matter of civic good. Alongside this shift came the influence of industrial efficiency on the same medical models. Just as factories optimized output and labor, healthcare began incorporating principles like standardization, reproducibility, and specialized training. Medical education adapted to these values, and institutions like therapy schools emerged to formalize new ways of thinking about care. This historical moment laid the groundwork for clinical engineering, not just in technology, but in the broader cultural belief that health systems should be structured, reliable, and ethically accountable. Frank S. Betts was more than a medical instrument manufacturer. He was an early architect of healthcare education systems. In the early 1900s, Betts opened therapy schools in major U.S. cities that focused on training general practitioners to administer electrotherapy, hydrotherapy, and heat treatments. These schools were designed to democratize access to technical therapies. Rather than relying on specialists or hospitals, vets enabled general practitioners, often working in small or rural practices, to deliver technologically guided treatments on their own. The curriculum wasn't purely mechanical. These schools embodied the progressive era ethos, efficiency, self reliance, and public service. Doctors weren't just trained in the how, but in the why. Positioning therapy was part of their moral and civic responsibility. Betts's model blurred the lines between education, commerce, and ethics. It promoted non invasive care, reinforced trust in machine guided healing, and encouraged clinicians to become ethical operators of medical technology. This is a direct philosophical precursor to clinical engineering today. The belief that those who work with medical systems must understand not just function, but impact, safety, and service. During the early 1900s, the therapy schools weren't just vocational institutions. Again, they were ethical spaces grounded in a belief that health was a sacred responsibility. Leaders like Frank S. Betts positioned these schools with a Christian worldview, aligning therapy work with the duty to heal. The act of treating someone wasn't just technical, it was a form of service, an expression of moral care. In this view, health was both physical and spiritual. Taking care of the body meant honoring the life it held. Illness was not just a medical event, but a moment of vulnerability that called for humility, compassion, and moral attention. Educators in these schools often emphasize the character of the healer just as much as their technical ability. This idea linking education to moral stewardship paved the way for the ethical foundation of clinical engineering. Today, clinical engineers are not just responsible for equipment, they are entrusted with patient safety, system integrity, and the ongoing faith that machines will do no harm. Their work is a modern extension of this same calling to heal not just with skill, but with the responsibility and reverence. What we see in Betts therapy schools is more than just historical curiosity. It's the early architecture of what we now call clinical engineering. First, Betts introduced the early integration of technology into clinical spaces. These weren't makeshift treatments, they were structured, repeatable, and taught as standardized methods. This approach mirrors how modern clinical systems are expected to perform consistently, safely, and in harmony with human care. Second, Betts' model emphasized training, maintenance, and usability. Practitioners weren't just handed machines, they were educated in how to apply them responsibly. That idea, training clinicians and ensuring device usability, sits at the core of today's clinical engineering philosophy. Finally, the systems Betts helped build laid the groundwork for tech support clinical care. Long before biomeds and engineers were job titles, these therapy systems created routines of equipment selection, upkeep, and ethical operation. So while Betts may not have called it clinical engineering, his work embodied the mindset that healthcare system must be technically sound, morally grounded, and user-centered. That legacy continues every time a clinical engineer tests a device, trains a provider, or improves the system's safety. So we're now full circle, connecting the innovations of early therapy education to the foundational values of modern clinical engineering. What we saw in Betts therapy schools was a fusion of technology and mission. Devices weren't just tools, they were vehicles for healing, instruction, and service. Practitioners were taught to use technology not just effectively, but ethically, with attention to patient safety, accessibility, and dignity. The progressive era reframed healthcare itself. It emphasized efficiency, but not at the expense of compassion. It promoted systems, but grounded those systems in social good. Education, reform, and public service worked together to reimagine what care could look like. And this is exactly where clinical engineering picks up. It inherits this dual legacy of technical mastery and moral purpose. Clinical engineers are not just technicians, they are stewards of safety. They are educators, troubleshooters, and advocates for patients who may never know their names, but whose lives depend on their systems working right. So, when we talk about the roots of clinical engineering, we're talking about more than machines. We're talking about a worldview, one that sees healing not only as a science, but as a calling.